Thank you very much. First of all, may I say that I completely agree with your calls and campaigning for more social and for more social and affordable housing. But while all of us would agree that there need to be targets, and in essence, your good selves have also highlighted that, but targets don't by themselves build more homes. Now, what, in your opinion, what are the core reasons why there are still low numbers of social and affordable rented homes being built at the moment, and how can we overcome that? Ms. Alafat?
Yes. Well, I think the first thing we need to acknowledge is that the affordable homes program in total now is about 1.5 billion, and in 2010-11 it was about 4 billion. So the first thing you might say is, what's the total investment going towards affordable housing, but in particular social housing? I mean, one of the things we've said again and again is that if you look at the total amount of housing-related spend by this government, it's in total quite significant. I mean, it's a combination of grants, loans, investment, but you're talking about something close to 53 billion. But if you look at the way the money and the way the investment is being made, 75% is going towards the private sector and about 25% is targeted towards the affordable sector. So the first question is, in terms of total investment, because every government has to decide how it uses its money, if a target was set for additional affordable housing, how might you look at the existing spend and spend it differently? So that's one thing. The second thing is, I think all of us would say, is you can't produce social housing without a degree of subsidy. And the current grant levels that are going in are just not sufficient, so there would have to be an increase in grant. And indeed, in the work that we've done with NHF and others, we've given an estimate of what the grant levels would be. So that's the second thing. The third thing, though, I think, which is important, is that if you think of forms of subsidy, one of the things we know has happened is quite a lot is borrowers raised in the private market. So what else can be done to make that borrowing more affordable? And that we were very pleased to see the Affordable Homes Guarantee brought back in, because that actually helps small to medium-sized associations access the bond market. But I think also looking at whatever means can be made to make borrowing more accessible will help organizations bring in private finance. So I think it is about grant. I think it's about grant levels to get to social housing, and I think it's looking in the round at the money that is available, the investment, the different means, and bring that together to try to deliver more affordable housing.
Mr. Beals?
Yes, well, I'd agree a lot with what Terry was saying there. I mean, I think there's as a country we're failing to see social housing investment in terms of infrastructure and infrastructure investment. If you look at the amount we're spending on social housing and you compare it to the overall capital infrastructure budget, it's less than 3%. That compares to 20% of our capital budgets on energy, 16% on transport. So it's a small proportion of the infrastructure spend as it is currently. And too often, the Treasury orthodoxy sees this investment as being equivalent to any other day-to-day spending, when what we actually know, as you'll have seen in the Commission findings that we produced, a 20-year programme of social housing investment pays back to the Exchequer over 40 years. And it's got that in common with other infrastructure programmes. And so if we start to think about this as infrastructure investment, as of long-term benefit to the country, and we start to consider it against other infrastructure commitments, you can start to see how the kind of expenditure that we're advocating, as advocated by the NHF report, becomes very affordable in the long run and well worth it for UK PLC.
Okay, and Ms. Henderson?
I would agree with both Greg and Terry. I think that the reason that we have around 6,000 social homes built last year is a lack of grant investment, and that happened, that those cuts that came through from 2010 onwards has had a really significant impact on the sector's ability to deliver social rented homes. We have been delivering them. We've been delivering them mostly through cross-subsidy, which has been really positive in terms of the sector innovating, delivering different tenures, using any surpluses generated from market sale and market rent to reinvest back into social and affordable programmes. But it also means that the housing association sector is now more susceptible to market volatility and a market downturn. And I think that's a really important point to make, that we cannot rely on cross-subsidy to fund our social housing programme in an economic downturn.
Okay. Mr. Beals, Ms. Elifat referred to it, but in your opinion, which government initiatives have actually helped to deliver more social and affordable homes, and which have not?
Yeah, so you mean recent initiatives. So last year, we've got a waiting list at the moment of more than 1 million people waiting for a social home. We only built 6,000 last year. So the current policy framework is a failure. Yeah. It's a failure in terms of social housing. It's obviously a failure in terms of housing outcomes overall. We could talk about that at some length. I mean, I think there are things the government have committed to which begin to address that. So the removal of borrowing restrictions on local authorities, for example, should make a difference. We think it could contribute up to 10,000 social homes, depending on how local authorities respond to that. And the government have gone some way to begin to tighten this framework around Section 106, which compels developers to develop some affordable and social homes when they're developing homes for private sale. So those things will make some difference, but we are miles away from a policy framework which will deliver anything like the number of homes that we need. In fact, we're going in the wrong direction at the moment.
Okay. And Ms Henderson, how do you think that the government can actually balance the aspirations, on the one hand, between home ownership and on the other hand, with the need for more affordable and social rented homes?
So just picking up on the previous point about what's working now as well. So we have seen some really welcome changes over the last 18 months. The housing revenue account is something that's very positive for local authorities' ability to build and borrow, particularly working in partnership. We have also seen Homes England come forward with strategic partnerships which are unlocking growth at scale, and we're really encouraged by the action that Homes England is taking and want to see more. There was also the future funding of $2 billion for the sector that's been announced. And again, anything that it's a really important start towards our funding asks in the long term. In terms of balancing between home ownership and the need to invest in social and affordable housing, it really shouldn't be an either or. Yeah. But government has a decision about where the political will is to support the people who might need housing the most. So we know as a country we need to build at least 300,000. Our research says 340,000 homes a year. Yeah. Those 90,000 social rented, the 145,000 in total affordable housing will not be delivered without subsidy, and that is where we're calling on government to make the investment of 12.8 billion a year.
And in your opinion, has the introduction of affordable rented homes, has that been a success or not?
I think in the introducing intermediate tenures like affordable rent, that has worked in some housing markets, but introducing one mechanism, and we know we need around 30,000 kind of intermediate rented homes as part of the market, it doesn't replace the need for the 90,000 social rented homes. So whilst that has been a way of getting some investment into delivering new affordable rented properties, it doesn't replace the need for social rented properties, which are typically at 50% of market rent, some parts of the country as low as 30% of market rent. In terms of home ownership, though, there's absolutely an ambition in this country to provide people with homes of their own. And for many people, that is something they absolutely aspire to do. Yeah. As a sector, we're really supportive of that. We are about to launch a shared ownership campaign. We think this has got a huge opportunity for first-time buyers, and it's something we're actively looking at. But that is in addition to the investment that's needed, the capital investment that's needed in social rented homes. Okay,
thank you, Roger. It's good to see yourself again, Kate. And Ms. Elifat, if we can drill down a bit into definitions, how should affordability be defined? And do you actually agree with the Affordable Housing Commission's conclusion that affordability should be defined as a third of a household income? And if so, how should income itself be defined?
Yes. We also, well, first of all, just to say, we had produced a report a number of years ago called Building Bridges, and within that we looked at the issue of affordability. So we've been very much in line for fairly consistently saying that about 30% of income makes sense. But I think the key thing is, as you say, what income are you looking at? And I think if we're talking about affordability for people on low incomes, then it needs to be pegged to the local markets, and it needs to be pegged to people that the low income level, so 30% of low income. So I think that's one thing. Mm-hmm. The second thing I think would be really interesting is to look at For working households, now we all know that there are many, many working households, and it's increased over time on housing benefit. So again, if you look at working households in different areas, and again, you'd have to look at the local housing market in these areas and start looking at the housing benefit of people working. Again, could you peg rents to actually get to a point where people that are working are able to afford the rent? So that's the second thing. We've also suggested, and we suggested this a number of years ago, and I'm afraid not very much has happened, but we've tried to encourage, and we would like to see government endorse, housing authorities with housing associations in their local areas setting local affordability frameworks. So even within any type of rent settlement, you actually start working together on a local level, and this came out of the Building Bridges report. It's interesting to me that we've had now a number of reports that have come out saying similar things on affordability, and I think it's kind of come to the point where we should take some action and start doing some of this. Yeah. Because the reality is, and Kate mentioned affordable rent, but when I look at the affordable rent figures and I look at, for example, percentages of people on housing benefit in affordable rent properties and social rent properties, they're similar. And so what you're finding is people in those more expensive properties are also on housing benefit and not able to afford them. And you'll hear anecdotally from housing associations saying the same thing. Affordable rent was never intended to be a forever product instead of social housing. And I think that's very important. That's not to say there isn't a need for an intermediate product, but the reality is it can't be instead of social housing because it's not truly affordable.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mark.